am thrilled that you're all here, and I can't even believe that we got to have this event. Earlier this year, my husband and I were watching PBS. I think it was the very beginning of January, and Judy Woodruff was interviewing Bishop Michael Curry, and it was a 7-minute interview, and we were transfixed. We were transformed by this conversation. And, it felt a little bit like, the kaleidoscopes, they still make those, I assume. Felt like the kaleidoscope had just changed a little bit. And I thought, I'm going to go right out and get the book. The book, is Erica held up, is Love is the Way, Holding On to Hope in Troubling Times. And Erica was being gracious, saying, if you want to buy the book, you're going to have to buy the book, because I think it's one of the most important books I think we could read for these times. The bishop is, here is this man who is descended from slaves, descended from sharecroppers, descended from ministers, and he's now the presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church of the United States. And what he gives us is an inspirational roadmap for living a life of love, even when we're seduced to get angry and annoyed and think love is exactly the wrong thing to do. You might enter this conversation as a skeptic, although you did sign up for the event. But I guarantee you will leave this conversation believing and thinking that you can and will live a life of love and contribute to all of us leading a life of love. So with that, I know Erica already asked you, we can have your virtual, I'm sure there's like a wave of applause. The Most Reverend Bishop Michael Curry, welcome.
Oh, Roxanne, thank you. What an introduction.
I was going to say hello.
I didn't know what you were going to say. Oh, that's great. Thank you for having me. And that conversation with Judy and she's incredible.
Oh, that was great. That was great. So I want to start with this. I came across one of the Instagram feeds I have is the Beinecke Library, which you might be familiar with as someone who went to divinity school in New Haven, actually across the street from where I live.
Nope. Really?
Yeah, I live on Lawrence Street right there.
Oh, okay.
And they posted this poem that I'm going to read on the first day of Black History Month. And the poem is from Langston Hughes. Bring me all your dreams, you dreamers. Bring me all of your heart melodies, that I might wrap them in a blue cloud cloth, away from the too rough fingers of the world. You say in the book that the language of dreams is, in fact, the language of hope. But we are, as we know too well, yes, living in the too rough fingers of the world. And the logical question to ask is, how impossible is it to believe that love is the way when it seems like hate and despair and division surrounds us?
Wow. Well, I mean, Roxanne, the reality is in the end, it becomes a matter of faith. And I don't mean that in terms of a particular religious tradition.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you almost have to trust and then take the risk to live on that, live that out. Now, there's some evidence, it seems to me. One, it's not easy. And that we have the human capacity to love, and that's part of our grandeur. But we also have the human capacity to do the opposite of love, do that which is unloving. And so we're a mixer. We're somebody once said there's a little bit of good in the worst of us, a little bit of bad in the best of us, and that's that's to be human. And so it's not easy, and it's not easy in particular when love is not reciprocated or received or accepted.
Right.
And that's when it's tough. When I was growing up, I remember folk. I mean, the old folk used to quote. They didn't know they were quoting Booker T. Washington. I later found out he was the one who had said it. But they would say, "Never let any man drag you so low as to hate them."
Yeah.
And that was said. I mean, I learned that in the context of segregation and civil rights and that kind of thing. And folk would say that all the time. Never let anybody drag you so low as to hate them. But the truth of the matter is it's sometimes easier to respond in pure anger. There's nothing wrong with appropriate anger. I mean, we're humans, so we're going to have feelings. But the reality is, if you live there, it will eat you up.
Right.
No matter what it does to the other. It doesn't do anything to the other person. It will eat you. It will consume you, and it will take you apart. And so the reality is, the way of the kind of unselfish love that I'm talking about, that really is committed to seeking the good and the welfare and the well-being of others as well as the self, that way of love really in the long run is a way of life. And it's a way of life that makes life livable, even though it's difficult to do. And
you talk in the book is that it doesn't mean that life's not a struggle. And, you talk about Nellie Goldie Royster Strayhorn,
my grandmother,
your grandmother.
Yeah.
And so when we try to live this kind of life of love, where do we place the struggle that you're going to run into along the way? How do we sort of encompass that, register it, and still move to the next stage of continuing to love? How do you do that?
I mean, this is part of I learned about this way of love from people who were involved in civil rights, which meant they were intrinsically involved in a struggle.
Yeah.
And in a struggle against the odds. I mean, 1956 and 1955 and the Montgomery bus boycott, the odds of that succeeding were not great. It wasn't clear how that struggle would eventually work itself out. Growing up, we didn't necessarily. I mean, my grandmother never imagined a Barack Obama. He wasn't born yet anyway. But she never even imagined that was possible. You know what I mean? That was just simply not on the horizon, even of hope.
Yeah.
And so it was in that context. I don't want to say it was all bleak, but in that context, I mean, 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama, my Aunt Callie taught Sunday school in that church.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I mean, in that context, that's where I learned about love most profoundly. People who would say, never let anybody drag you so low as to hate them. You can change things, and it's a struggle, but you can change things by the power of a love that is yours, but is not just your own, that has its source and its origin ultimately in God. And if that is true, then you can make it no matter what. In the end, as a friend of mine says, in the end, love is gonna win. It won't be easy. It will be a struggle. It's going to be hard. And folk in that context understood that whether you like it or not, life is struggle. Human progress. Dr. King said it well. He said, progress does not happen on the wheels of inevitability. It only happens by struggle and strife and hard work and dogged determination and unwillingness to give up. And that's been true of any kind of human progress for the good. It has taken work and that dogged determination not to quit. And so love has the capacity to help me engage that in ways that do not dehumanize me and do not dehumanize others.
Yeah.
And that's where love, and I know the problem in English is we got the one word love. We don't have nuances. We don't have, we just don't have the nuances. The Greek language, that certainly of the New Testament, in Hebrew, all of these traditions, other languages have nuances on love. And so when you're talking about romantic love, there's one word for that. When you're talking about eros in Greek, friendship, philia, the kind of love that I'm talking about, agape, that unselfish, sacrificial, almost selfless love that paradoxically helps you discover the real self. That way of that kind of love is the love that makes a difference. And Roxanne, it's the only thing that ever has. I was in the well, I'm not sure, probably third or fourth grade, and I remember coming home, and my father asked me, "Did you get your medicine today?" I said, "What medicine?" I mean, for a second, I didn't get what he was talking about. And he said, "Did you get a little sugar cube?" And I said, "Oh yeah, I got it." Yeah, they had a little sugar cube and it had a little, I think it was red, something on it. And we ate the sugar cube. And I'm sure they told us what it was for, but when you're a kid, you just do what the teacher tells you to do. And he was,
those were the days.
yeah, yeah, it's not true anymore, but it's, so I didn't make too much of it, and he was kind of happy about it. Years later, and this really was years later, in the 1990s, he had had a stroke and he was in intensive care, and I was in the room with him and his sister, Carrie. Anyway, she was rubbing his legs and singing hymns, singing old hymns. And I asked her, why was she rubbing his legs? Because he was coming out of surgery and he was still, relatively sedated. And she said, "That's what Mama used to do when he was a little boy." I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "Didn't you know?" I said, Didn't I know what?" She said, "Didn't you know your daddy had polio?"
Mm.
And I realized, I said, he always walked with a slight limp. I knew that. And he jokingly called himself Hopalong Cassidy. But I never knew why until
He never
that.
told you the story.
And then I realized why he smiled when his son had that little sugar cube with the vaccine for polio. Johannes Salk and all of those other researchers and folk who did that, they sacrificed. They sacrificed time. They sacrificed labor. God knows they didn't see their families because they kept working, like these researchers working on a COVID vaccine. I guarantee you there are people sacrificing time and energy, not for themselves, but for the good they can do. That's what love looks like. That's what I'm talking about. And that kind of love and devotion for the good and welfare of others as well as the self, that is a game changer in human life. Always has been and always will be.
So speaking of your dad, who was a minister also, so we're going to put the story in Chicago. Your mom's in school studying math, right? At the University of Chicago?
Yeah.
Right. And your grandfather had been a Baptist minister. Both your father and your mother were raised in the Baptist church.
Both of them were, yeah.
That story about your dad going to an Episcopal church for the first time with your mother, just I had a visceral reaction to the power of what happened in that church. Tell us that story.
It's funny. He would tell us that story as kids, and we got tired of hearing it. And my kids don't want to hear it either, but that's sort of the way it goes. But my father grew up, his father was a Baptist preacher and his grandfather was some kind of preacher in those days. You're getting back that far. Who knows what they were just,
what that meant,
what that really meant. Right. And, but he grew up in that Baptist tradition and he didn't know anything about the Episcopal church, had never encountered it, until he met my mother. And so they were dating. And she invited him to go to church with him. And so he went to church with her, and it was an Episcopal church, and they were having communion. And during the communion, first of all, they got to the church, and they were either the only or among a few Black people in the congregation. So it was a predominantly white setting. At that time, this happened in Southern Ohio. And so they were in the church, and time for communion, and she went up to receive communion at the altar rail. People would go up, and the priest would come along with the bread and then with the cup, the wine in a common cup. Well, Daddy was looking, and everybody got the bread. That was fine. But then he noticed they only had this one cup. And in the Baptist church, everybody has their own individual cups. And he had never seen one cup, people drinking from the same chalice. And he kept watching, and he said he watched when the person on the other side of in front of my mother was white, and that person drank from the cup. Next person was white, they drank from the cup. And there was my mother, and she was dark complected. There was no question about her.
Yeah, they weren't going to mistake her for
They
somebody.
weren't going to mistake her. And she drank from the cup, and he said he watched to see what the next person would do. And that next person drank from the cup, and on and on and on, like nothing was happening, like it was normal. And he said any church where Black folk and white folk drink from the same cup knows something about the teachings of Jesus that I want to be a part of. And he spent most of his ministry in the work of civil rights and reconciliation, and he committed himself. It was really a remarkable, thinking about it now.
Yeah.
It was
what year would that have been? That would have been in
late 40s. It would have been in the late 40s.
So do you think that was true about that parish or about the, because that seems, when you think about how ingrained Jim Crow and segregation was in those days, it's hard to even imagine, like, was it about that minister, that church, or was it, who knows?
It wouldn't have been, on one hand, it would have been theoretically true in terms of the expectations of the church, but practically on the local level, I think it would have varied from congregation to congregation.
Yeah.
And certainly in the South, it wouldn't have necessarily been the case. The further south you went, it wouldn't have been the case. So it was not an anomaly, but it was not the norm either. You know what I mean? At the time, they were in the right church with the right, you're right, the right pastor.
Here you are, the first Black bishop. Yeah. That's the presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church. How aware were you coming along that this was going to be different, or a struggle, or change your role, or change the church?
I can't say that I was aware. Certainly growing up, you're not aware of it. Daddy was always real clear that whatever he would say, whatever you all decide to do, you're talking to me and my sister, whatever you decide to do something that makes a difference for somebody else beside yourself. You've been put here to serve. The way he would say it was, periodically he would say, remember, the Lord didn't put you here just to consume oxygen. Yeah. So you're here for a positive purpose, to actually give something as well as to receive, but to give something. So I went off to school pretty much thinking that, when I was a little kid, you want to be like your dad, of course, but then you kind of evolve out of that. And I actually worked on, when I say sounds a little bit more grand than it was, I volunteered for Bobby Kennedy's campaign when he was running. This was when he was running for Senate in New York State. And when I say I volunteered, that means I licked envelopes and knocked on doors. Yeah. So it wasn't an exalted position.
You weren't writing his speeches?
No, he didn't ask me to write the speeches. No.
He would now.
Well, maybe, yeah, sure. So, so I did that, and, didn't know what I was going to kind of do with my own life. And eventually realized I took a course in college where I actually had to read the writings of Dr. King, who I knew about. When I was 5 years old, Daddy took me to some kind of, I don't remember, it was a rally or something. And Dr. King came to speak either in Buffalo or in Rochester. I can't remember where we were. And I was about 5 years old. And all the preachers, everybody had to get up and give a speech, a great oration. And I never heard King speak because I fell asleep. He was the last one to speak. So I missed my one opportunity to actually hear him speak. But I actually got in college to read what he wrote, and to read some of his works in more depth beyond some of the speeches, in fact. And realized that he saw faith, religious faith, as having the possibility of transforming both the social structures that can bind and enslave folk and the human heart that can bind us as well. And that's when I kind of realized, maybe the ministry is a way that Michael Curry can make his contribution. And maybe that fits in with my family and life, and all that kind of stuff. And So I ended up doing it, and that was back in the 1970s, mid 70s, and been doing it for years. And like Maya Angelou said, quoting that old spiritual, she said, "Wouldn't take nothing from a journey now."
Mm.
Uh,
It was a
it's
good move, Bishop.
it was a good move.
It was a good move.
It
So that story reminds me of two questions. One is, these days remind me a lot of 1968. And I was in college in 1968. I was in college in Washington, D.C.
we really,
And there comes April 4th.
yeah,
There comes June 5th. And there had been so much optimism around Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy. And then they're shockingly both killed within months of each other.
right.
I remember I was in my dorm on the corner of 19th and F, and there were tanks on the street because of the riots and the burning over on 14th Street.
That's
that
right.
was going on. And yet in the book, you talk about that even with all that hopelessness and despair, that actually love and hope emerged from that period of time. How did that happen? And do you think that's like now?
Yeah, I mean, love emerged from the ashes. It did, but it wasn't easy. There was a lot of anger, a lot of hope. I mean, hope dashed. There is nothing worse than hope dashed on the altars of reality.
Mm-hmm.
It is, I mean, remember in Dante's, in the Divine Comedy, above the gates of hell, abandon hope, all ye who enter here.
Yeah.
It is to be without hope is to be in hell. I mean, that is, as long as you got some hope, just a little bit. You don't have to have a lot. If human beings have hope, we can endure the unendurable if we have to. But gosh, the absence of hope, that is a nightmare. And so, that was a moment, and actually had been a part of a period of time when people were beginning to, is the country going to fly apart? Remember, the riot started in 65, was Watts, I believe.
Yeah.
Between 65 and 68, the country was in turmoil, both racial turmoil and the Vietnam War, conflict over the Vietnam War. It was really escalating. And it was a tumultuous time. And that's where the struggle, it's in those moments, similar to where we are now, different context, but not unsimilar. We've been this way before, and it's important to remember we have been this way, and we have survived, hopefully better than we were going in. But it was in this time that King started becoming frustrated. I mean, when he died, he was really frustrated, and just didn't know how the movement was going to go. He was under severe criticism. I mean, he really was. And he began to say over and over and over again, we will either learn to live together as brothers and sisters, or we will perish together as fools. Choice is ours, chaos or community. And in the last few months of his life, there was a moment, and it's on a recording. I don't think it was actually in a book. King blurted out, in one context, he just said, I know it's against the odds. I know a lot of people don't buy it, but I will not give up on love.
And Bishop,
we must not give up on love, even when the citadel, the temple of democracy itself, is breached by hatred and bigotry and bile. We must not give up on love. I'm sorry, you were going to say something.
No, well, I shouldn't have uttered anything, but the thing that I'm struck by as we watch what happened in 2020 on the issue of race and the awareness that grew and grew and grew about the travesty of the criminal justice system towards Blacks. Do you feel like things are better from 68?
Oh, from 68?
Yeah.
Definitely yes, but also no.
Yeah.
you know, I mean, let there be no doubt. First of all, Michael Curry would not be presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church in 1968.
Yeah, damn straight.
I mean, it's guaranteed. That was guaranteed. So that, I mean, that Barack Obama would not have. I mean, there's a lot that would not. You know, Kamala Harris would not be vice president. I mean, that. I mean, you can go through those kinds of things. Oprah Winfrey was a kid. I mean, so you can go through, and the black middle class has grown, but poverty has increased.
Yeah.
We're still having it has increased, not just with black and brown and peoples of color, but the poverty among white people. I mean, the poverty in this country is real, and we've not found the solutions. We've made some progress, but we've not found.
And it seems to me that, you know, there's a number of new books out on poverty. It seems to me that that core issue, because that does make people hate, that does make them get unhealthy, that does make them take drugs, that does contribute to criminal behavior, you know, that. And why do you think that's such a stubborn and increasing and unacceptable problem that we're not solving?
I think on one level, we've not garnered a national resolve.
Yeah.
We will be better than this. We will marshal. This is the country that rebuilt Europe after the Second World War. I mean, we need a Marshall Plan to make poverty history in this country and around the world. It can be done. We do. And to garner the resources, to get all the brain power that we've got, to marshal industry, I mean, a collective decision. And maybe we'll get there. I mean, I'm hopeful. Maybe we will get there, because if we do, we can do it. We actually can do it. But it's going to involve massive investments in children and in education, from the time that child is conceived in the womb to the time they pop out, and to the time that every footstep that they take. And every child in this country has every opportunity for all of the educational possibilities in life forming. I mean, that level of social commitment is what's going to be required. If we can garner that, we can do it. Whether we will, I don't know, but we can do it. And we can make it better. So, you know, I think the reality is a lot of what we're seeing in white supremacy, the rise of that, a lot of that is happening among poor folk.
Right.
People who have not benefited from the prosperity of this country. And I'm not benefiting, so I blame Mexicans at the border. You see how it works?
Zero-sum game.
Yeah. And so, I mean, I get it. I mean, it's not just pure bile or pure hatred. It's not. Some of it is coming from despair.
And fear.
And fear. Yes. And so we've got to chip away at that. And I think we can. And there's some efforts I think that are good. I'm hopeful. Let me tell you what gave me hope last year. What gave me hope was the movement of primarily, but not exclusively, young people.
Yeah.
After the series of killings from George Floyd to Breonna Taylor and the series, something did happen when America saw that police officer with his knee on the neck of that man, snuffing the breath of life that God gave him, snuffing it out like he was nothing. And because most people are decent people. Most,
right.
And I think when people saw that, it was a moment of awakening. But it was the young people
who got out there.
They hit the streets. And I mean, they hit the streets. It wasn't my gang. It wasn't, I mean, they hit the streets. I mean, clergy were calling me, but these were young clergy, not me. You know, I was giving them what advice I could. I mean, but they were hitting the streets. And I have never seen in the history of this country a multiracial and multi-ethnic, as diverse a coalition of people hitting the streets, for the most part, non-violently. If there was trouble, it was caused by people on the fringe, not by those young people who were protesting. And they were their protest was a cry for America to be what we say we are. And this is the generation that didn't grow up with civics. We didn't teach them the Declaration of Independence, and yet they were proclaiming it. We didn't teach them the Gettysburg Address, and yet they were proclaiming it. This was the generation that grew up with Martin Luther King's birthday. And they knew intuitively that America can be America for everybody, that you said liberty and justice for all, let's make it real. And they hit the street. Roxanne, that's hope.
Yeah,
Nobody
I
programmed
totally
that.
agree.
It wasn't completely organized. I mean, there were elements of organized, but it wasn't like there was a national commission that thought this out in the strategic plan for how we're going to. It just, I mean, this is like
It was
spirit.
organic.
It was organic, exactly. It evolved. That's a sign of hope for me. That level of pragmatic idealism. Now, it must be translated into political reality and into economic realities. But without the idealism, all you have is rank pragmatism.
Mm.
There must be an ideal, a lofty goal, a conviction, a dominating conviction. Like the psalmist says in the Hebrew scriptures, set me upon a rock that is higher than I. There must be something that ennobles and lifts us up, that we then exercise pragmatic work to make that ideal real.
Mm.
We saw a glimpse of that. Those young people marching last summer,
Yeah.
in summer.
And you know, you talk, one of the things I want to make sure we'll get to, there's a couple more things I want to make sure we cover before we get to
Sure.
questions. But one of the things that this conversation reminds me of is, and I'm going to sort of jumble together a couple of things, but I bet you'll figure out an answer to I'm confident, Bishop, you'll figure this out. So here's all the things sort of jumbling around in my brain. One is, you talk about faith, and for many of us, faith has a religious context. Religion, of religious affiliation in the United States is in a decline. A lot of young people say they have no religious affiliation. So what form does faith, or can faith take outside of a religious context? And I'll read something you wrote in the book, which I thought was just fabulous. So this is from A Raisin in the Sun.
Oh, yeah.
And the mother, Beneatha's mother, believes in God, is going to count on God. And Beneatha says, Mama, you don't understand. It's all a matter of ideas, and God is just one idea I don't accept. It's not important. I'm not going to go out and be immoral or commit crimes because I don't believe in God. I don't even think about it. It's just that I got tired of him getting credit for all the things the human race achieves through its own stubborn effort. There simply is no blasted God. There is only man, and is he who makes miracles. So how would you talk to Beneatha or the youth or all the people that don't have a religious affiliation?
Well, with Beneatha, I tell Beneatha, how do you think your mother got over? How did she get as far as she got against the odds? I mean, really against the odds. And I could tell you about my grandmother. You mentioned Nellie Strayhorn, who would have been a grandchild of her grandparents would have been slaves. But she grew up a sharecropper's child.
Right.
And, and buried, people in those days had a lot of children, and they buried, a lot of them didn't make it through childbirth and that kind of thing. And I don't know, it was one or two I know that she buried in childbirth, and sent sons off to war, the Second World War. Fortunately, they came back, but lost other relatives in that war. And then she turned around, and when my mother had a massive cerebral hemorrhage when I was a kid, and I talk about that in the book, and she turned around in her 70s at that point, and helped my father raise these two children, this boy and this girl. And she continued to do it with, you know, I mean, everybody's grandma is a hero, but she was. I saw this woman when I look back on her. I saw this woman endure some things that were really unendurable in many respects. She grew, her childhood was shrouded in hooded night riders in Eastern North Carolina, not far
Yeah.
from where I am right now. I mean, it was, she grew up and that was her world. And the world didn't give her much. And, you know, and somehow she made it anyway. Now I have to ask myself the question, how did she do it? There used to be a song, a gospel song Mahalia Jackson used to sing, How I Got Over. And I asked, how did grandma get over? And part of the way, and my grandmother was a domestic worker. She cleaned folks' houses and put a daughter and two sons, got them through college.
Wow.
Now, how did she do that? Cleaning homes, cleaning houses her whole life. I mean, how did she do that? I know how she got over it. She used to drag us to church with us in the summer when we would be there, and we'd go to her Baptist church. You know, daddy was an Episcopalian, her daughter's, but grandma was a dyed-in-the-wool rock rib Baptist. And all I knew is I saw when grandma would be in that church and that old preacher got to preaching and the choir got to singing, that there was something that happened. There was a presence that somehow gave her a strength that mingled with her own and gave her the ability to live life and even, if you will, march through hell for a heavenly cause if she had to. Now, when I say, how did that woman know how to do that? She figured out how to live life in an insane context and stay sane. Now, how'd she do that? I'm telling you, God had something to do with that. And I just figured if it was good enough for her, it's good enough for me. And I believe it's for anybody who wants to make it in this world. You don't have to believe the way I believe. One of my favorite shows, I know this is probably ridiculous. I don't know if you ever watched Young Sheldon. I mean,
I know the show.
I love that show. There's a scene, and the mother is like really religious, and she kind of gets obnoxious with it too. And the whole fact, there's a lot of spoofing around all of that. But at one point, she says she's going to church, wants to know who's going to go to church with her. And the husband, he's got football practice, so he's got to meet with the coaches. And the older son, he said, "Oh, I got to be with dad and do football." And Sheldon says, "I'll go." And the sister says to Sheldon, she said, "You don't believe in God." And Sheldon says, "Well, no, but I believe in mom." Sometimes that's enough.
Yeah.
To
Right.
get the wisdom of others and to live that. Sometimes that's enough. I just know that the struggle in the work of human progress, in the work of helping us to be more than we would be on our own, by our own self-interest, in that work and in that labor, Dr. King was right. He said we need cosmic companionship. We've got to do our part, but we need God to help us do our part too. Somehow out of that partnership, we human beings have made progress and moved forward. And the truth is, if you look at most of the social, I want to call them social engineers, the social architects and engineers, the people who have been transformative agents and instruments in human history and society, they've had some religious tradition behind them.
Yeah. And
there's a reason you somehow need some transcendent power to help you in this mundane world. You just do. And it has nothing to do with us not having our own capabilities. It has to do with having cosmic companionship, partnership. I got what I got. I need God. Huh?
I love that term, cosmic companionship.
Cosmic companionship. Yeah, that was King. It was, yeah.
So Bishop, in the book, among the million things I loved about it, I am a pragmatic person. And so, the way for me to get my arms around these extraordinary concepts is to think about, okay, what do I got to get out there and do?
Yeah.
And what you did here in the book, and I'd love you to cover some of them, is you actually, if any of us think that our own little action in our own little world doesn't have tentacles and doesn't have reach, you remind us in the book that it absolutely does.
Yes.
So share with us a couple of the things that any of us, starting like 2 minutes after this conversation ends, can do.
There's a saying from John Wesley, the founder of the old Methodist movement. He said, do all the good you can in every way you can with everybody you can. Just do all the good you can. I really do believe that that's what a life of love looks like, that passionately committed to doing the good in every way that I can in the sphere of my influence. And by doing that, I may have impact. It may be like a butterfly effect. I may not see the result of that, but it will have impact beyond what I know. And the more of us who are doing that, the impact becomes greater. And I just believe that practically, what is the good that I can do? I was in an interview a while back with a business magazine, and this was about love, and the interviewer said, you know, the religious language doesn't necessarily communicate to the corporate world. I said, okay, I'll grant you
All
that.
right.
Fair. That's fair. And she said, how does this translate into a world, into our world where we are, where most of our subscribers are? And I said, well, it's the difference between me and we. If it's all about me, that's not love. But if it's about we, that includes me, and that's what love is going to look like. So when you're making decisions, is it just about me? When I say me, I'm talking about me or mine or my,
Yeah.
you know, if it's just about me, that's not what love looks like. But if it's about we, it's about a greater good, about a greater whole. If it blesses and benefits others beyond just me or just my own group or just my own self-interest, that now you're talking about love. I said that translates into politics, that translates into business, that translates into every human endeavor, and it makes all the difference in the world. It really does. And so I forgot what the original question was.
Well, I'll come back to it in a second, but you're reminding me of something else that I think was a very powerful distinction that we need to remember. And that was that you said loving someone doesn't mean you agree with them. Right? Because I think we've really gotten to think, if we don't agree on politics and we don't agree on this and that, you know what? I don't think we can love. So spend a minute, Bishop, talking about how you find your way to preserving the love and the common ground, even if you disagree.
We were some years ago, this was a number of years ago now, the Episcopal Church was wrestling with the question of what eventually became articulated in terms of same-sex marriage. But at the time was, what does profound equality in the church community look like for LGBTQ folk? I mean, what does that look like? And so a number of us, I was part of that, really worked together both to support the LGBT community and to advocate for changing not marriage, but who marriage applied to. We weren't changing the you know, and this was a reinterpretation of tradition of long-standing ancient traditions. Anyway, you can well imagine this was a real conflict in the church. It was a real and had gone on for a number of years, and it really was. But it was just a real conflict. And I was Bishop of North Carolina at the time, and at the time, Gene Robinson, who was a priest in New Hampshire, was elected as the Bishop of New Hampshire. And everything just blew. Everything, just to think that there would be a partnered gay bishop. It just blew. And the worldwide Anglican communion, I mean, England, the Church of England awoke. There were reactions around the world. I mean, it went on. In the context of that time, I relearned some training I had had years before in nonviolent ways of communication and social change. I relearned that you've got to learn how to both kneel and stand at the same time.
Mm.
To kneel in a sense before even the person you disagree with, but to see them as they are a child of God, made in the image of God. They are, as Martin Buber said, they are thou, not it.
Mm-hmm.
Thing. They are thou, even though you disagree with them, and even though they're yelling at you, they are thou, not it. They are your brother, your sister, your sibling. You must kneel in your heart before them. And at the same time, you must stand up for the convictions that you hold. You've got to learn to both kneel and stand at the same time, not just stand, because that's a self-righteousness that can be destructive. And not kneeling, that's capitulation. But to kneel and stand at the same time. And I relearned it. And it's hard. I mean, John Lewis, I've heard him say, the way of nonviolent love is not easy. And yet it will set you free.
Mm-hmm.
And so in the course of that whole transformation, I was not popular very often. And there were those who disagreed with me to the point of anger. And I remember one time, my daughter and one of her friends came to the office with me for something, and we were going, it was a Saturday, we were going somewhere, and we stopped by the office, and she was, I don't know, maybe 10. She and one of her friends were in the car. And she said, "Can we come in the office with you?" I said, "Yeah, why do you all want to come in the office?" She said, "Oh, we want to see your hate mail." And this was in the days when you actually got real mail.
You got mail.
It was real mail, yeah. And so it was in that kind of context that what I learned from those folk as a child: never let anybody drag you so low as to hate them.
Mm.
It will consume you, and it will hurt them. And so that became my mantra: kneel and stand, kneel and stand. And I intentionally did stuff like adding on my little prayer list some of the people who were maddest at me. And it's, again, it's
pray
a work
for them. And pray for them.
And pray for them. Yeah. You actually have to, it helps. It doesn't solve it all. It doesn't, we're human. And yet we can be in partnership with a higher power. Mm-hmm. My lower self can be raised up to some nobility and grandeur.
Yeah. What you just mentioned about Martin Buber, who is one of my favorite philosophers to read, and one of my other favorite writers is James Baldwin, and it reminds me of his book, No One Knows My Name, about being an it, yes. Invisible, not a person.
Yes.
And yes. When we know them as a person, it's by definition seems like harder to hate.
It actually is. It really is harder when
you might hate generally, like,
abstract. Yeah,
yeah.
But, and I'll tell you when it gets, my daddy did used to say, he wasn't talking about hatred specifically, but he said, never judge a book by its cover, always read the book. Mm-hmm. And what I think he meant, I never asked him, when, some of these things your parents and people say, you didn't ask them when you were a kid. But what I think he was getting at was that if you listen to the story of anybody, you will discover if they are angry and negative, there's a reason, there's a story behind that.
Yeah, there's a story.
There's a story there. And sometimes when you know that story or their story, you can at least understand. One of the ways, one of the ways that you actually work to bring about social healing, obviously you have to change some things in society, but one of the ways that you do that between people is you let them share each other's stories, share and listen to each other's stories. And walls do come down. It's like the walls of Joshua fought the Battle of Jericho, in the Bible. It's like the walls come tumbling down, because when I actually listen to your story and you listen to mine, there's an intimacy being shared there. And when that intimacy is being shared, then there is common ground being created. You may not agree, but there's a relationship. That's what Buber was teaching us. Right. I-thou relationships aren't predicated upon agreement. they are predicated upon honoring each other's God-given humanity. And
Yeah.
that creates common ground. If both of us, you know, and we've actually seen a little bit of it. This isn't in the book, but Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Anton Scalia.
Right. Who were buddies.
Yes. And they didn't agree on a whole lot. And
Maybe anything.
I was thinking maybe anything. Yeah. And yet there was something they shared. Each one, there was in the RBG. I mean, I love the notorious RBG. Only in America could you have the notorious RBG. Anyway, in the documentary that was on CNN a while back about her, I mean, they asked her about the friendship between the two of them, and she said, "Well, we both love to travel, and so we and our spouses would travel together." And then she said, "We both loved opera." And she used the word loved each time. It was real interesting. We both loved opera. And then she said, and this was powerful, she said, and we both have a deep, profound love and respect for the Constitution of the United States. And just said, we, the people of the United States of America, in order to form a more perfect union, went on. It was like a shared common love created a common human space where two people who disagreed profoundly were able to do it in love and charity. That's powerful stuff. I mean,
Yeah.
and it happens more often than it does, but it takes people actually knowing each other in some depth.
One of the best things I learned from my dad, who was an immigrant and knew what it was like, and a Holocaust survivor, and knew what it was like to be invisible. That was a great listener and loved everybody's story. And I'd watch what the power of being heard would do to the guy sweeping in the supermarket or the toll booth collector, or, in the slightest interaction, he could create the sense and understanding that that person was being heard. They could have talked for hours telling their story.
Yeah.
Right? People want to tell their story.
Sure. We're actually much more interesting than we realize all the time. We actually are.
So before we close and before we get to the questions, this is like lofty, but I want to get down a little bit in the gossip world for a minute.
In the gossip world?
Yeah.
Okay.
So you just stay with me here. Okay. So you're home or you're somewhere in, a few years ago, and you get a call from this, like, I don't even know who, I'll ask you who, saying, how would you like to come to St. George's at Windsor Castle and give a little talk at a little royal wedding? So let's start with this. Who called you and what they say?
Well, actually, it was a member of my
these calls.
I was traveling. I don't remember where I was, but I was en route somewhere. And actually came from the Archbishop of Canterbury.
Just him. He called.
So he got this one member of my staff, Chuck Robertson. His office got Chuck. And then the Archbishop explained to him that he needed to talk with me. So whenever I landed, wherever I was, I called, and we had to get through time zones. But I mean, I eventually got, like, the next day, got the Archbishop, and the way he said it was, he's been working with the couple, and they were talking about preachers for the service. And he said, if you were asked, would you be available to offer the address, is what is in England they call it, offer the address at the upcoming royal wedding on the date that it was on. And I'm thinking, like, well, I need to check my calendar, but I mean, clearly my calendar could get cleared. And actually,
we'll get free.
Yeah, I think I could work something out. But in all honesty, when the staff member called me to tell me what it was about, I thought it was a spoof. I honestly did. I said, what do you really want? I mean, get out of here. What do you want? What do we talk? So I didn't actually believe it. And then couldn't tell anybody for a while because it had to go through approvals. And there were approvals and things that I say it kind of has to go from palace to palace, and have various levels of approval and that kind of thing. And it was about a couple of weeks later that I knew for sure. But even then, I couldn't say anything because they really were trying to manage the media,
Yeah.
and not have things dribbling out, and which I certainly understood. And so I couldn't even tell my wife for about a month.
But I remember, I'm sure this was true for the other billions of people watching it, and you got up there and you started speaking, and I wasn't struck by the fact that you were a Black minister up there, but I was struck by the fact that you were going right into fiery, you were finding your Baptist DNA there, and I thought, it was like stunning. It was stunning to listen to. And did you ever think that you should give a more buttoned up sermon, given where you were and and the Queen was there?
Yeah, I moderated.
Continue?
I really did moderate a little bit. In fact, there was a moment at which I almost stepped out of the little, it was a lectern, and I realized, no, don't, because I like to walk when I
Yeah.
speak. Nah, I've pushed this gang about as far as I need to. Just kind of stayed put. A funny thing did happen. It's in I haven't actually looked at the video, but there was a point at which I was quoting the old spiritual, the balm in Gilead, BALM, from Jeremiah. Is there no balm in Gilead to heal? And so it's a healing balm. And I was quoting the spiritual, and I knew it might not be that familiar in Britain, so I wasn't. So at one point I, said, there is a balm in Gilead to make the wounded whole. And I could see a security guy just out of the right side of my corner, and he looked up quickly, and I've added a healing balm to make the wound, just in case I didn't want to get jumped. Right?
LM.
Yeah, let me spell that for you.
Oh my goodness. Did you love doing it?
Yeah, I loved it more after it was over, after I had done it. Just the pressure of it. But
were you nervous?
Well, certainly beforehand, but not once you're in the moment. It was a wedding. It was a wedding.
And it's adrenaline.
Yeah. And in all honesty, they became a couple. I've married couples, been doing it for almost 40 years now.
Yeah.
And in the moment, we were in church. It was a service. It was a church service, clearly a different congregation, but a church service. My wife, the part she loved was Elton John kissed her hand. She just probably still hasn't washed her hands since then.
I don't know. That choir was pretty great.
Oh my gosh. And
they were unbelievable.
Oh my God. They were incredible.
Yeah. It was
and they were sweet people too. And somebody said, "Oh, did you bring them from America?" I said, "No, they're from London."
Right. Well, so we're a little bit over, and you've been gracious enough to say it was only bedtime keeping you from us. So let me do a couple of things to wrap up. One is I'm going to take a couple of questions. One is, I like this one. What's your favorite hymn?
My favorite what?
Hymn.
Actually, it actually is the Balm in Gilead one. It really is that one. I just love that hymn, partially because it talks about unselfish love as the healing balm in Gilead.
Yeah.
It really does. And it acknowledges, you think about people who were slaves singing this, who talk about absence of hope, who had no earthly hope that was discernible, singing, "Sometimes I feel discouraged and think my life's in vain, but then the Holy Spirit revives my soul again. Oh, there is a balm in Gilead." You know what I mean? It's almost as though when you hear them singing, it's like they're having a conversation with Jeremiah centuries ago across time. They're saying, "Jeremiah, there is a balm in Gilead. We understand what you're talking about when you talk about life being hard, and there's hope. Don't give up." It's a remarkable. Anyway, that's the quick answer.
You're going to make me go back and read all of that.
Oh yeah. Jeremiah was, it's amazing to think that they literally, it's like there's a conversation going across the centuries.
Yeah.
I asked, "Is there no balm in Gilead?" And they answer him, "There is."
Bishop, one of the questions is, what do you think in this kind of divisive environment, the institutional role of the Episcopal Church should be in politics?
In politics,
Yeah.
to continue to be an advocate for what is just and humane and decent and kind and compassionate, not from our own self-interest, but for the good of those that we could easily forget.
Mm.
The church's job, and I think the faith, and we work ecumenically and interfaith with even in DC, but in coalitions, because you need all of us together sometimes to get attention. Our job is not to engage our own self-interest, but it is to advocate for those who don't have somebody, who don't have big lobbies, to represent that, and also to be instruments of real human reconciliation across difference. That we've got to make e pluribus unum, from many one. We've got to make it real, and we've got to make this democracy work. And part of the key to doing that is helping us to be in relationship with each other and learn how to love each other. I mean, and so we've got to do that. And that's as important as social change in terms of politics and economic policy and that kind of thing, helping us to change the human heart and relationships between us. We've just got to do it. I mean, this democracy depends on it. And frankly, human civilization does.
Mm. So in the book, this was the question we were talking about a while ago, and I want to close with two things. So you lay out 9 steps that any of us can take. Mm-hmm. And there was one. I'm not going to recite them. Everybody's got to buy the book and they can read it. But there are real concrete steps that you lay out. And there was one that seemed so simple, yet so many of us probably don't do it. And that is, you say, sacrifice personal wishes in order that all men might be free. Recall that the opposite of love isn't hate, it's selfishness. Striving to look outward at the common good whenever possible is about as countercultural as you can get in this country. And the recommendation is, can you take 15 minutes a day? Mm-hmm. Just 15 minutes. Take it away from Instagram or some other, social media rabbit hole you go down. You don't say that, I'm saying that. Take 15 minutes a day to check in with family or a member of your community to find out how they are and whether you can help. Can you commit weekly or monthly time to a goal that benefits others? So 15 minutes a day, every day, to just pick up the phone and just check in with somebody.
Check in with somebody, yeah.
And at the end, after you lay out these 9 steps, which also was easy to imagine, if you will, I'm reading from the bishop's book, the impact of each and every person on this planet, taking the time to define and then live our loving principles. In fact, imagine 50% of everybody doing this and being successful only half the time. Politics, business, and commerce, religious life, and the community would be transformed.
There is no doubt in my mind, transformed. Congress would be different. The corporate world would be different. Our religious traditions would be different. Our country, our world. Dr. King said, we must discover the power of love, the redemptive power of love. And when we do, we will make of this old world a new world, because love is the only way. And he was right. And we can do it.
Bishop Michael Curry, I have loved this conversation. I am, yes, in love with you.
I love you too. You're awesome. You really are.
And I will become your, evangelical
All right.
spirit out there, getting the message out. This is, you probably all know, we've been talking with the Most Reverend Bishop Michael Curry, the author of Love is the Way, Holding On to Hope in Troubling Times. Bishop, this is such an important message at the right time when it feels, dark and scary, to remember that we can each do something.
We
We
can.
can each do something. We don't need to be you. We don't need to be the president. We just need to be whoever little person we are, and make it happen. So thank you for getting that message out there.
Thank you. Thank you, Roxanne. And thank you, everybody. Thank you for what you do. You are bringing light. I'm telling you. Somebody said, where did I see it? I saw it on a poster somewhere that said, if you can't travel, read a book and you can travel the world. Thank you for helping us to travel the world and make a different world. That's what you do, Roxanne. I'm in your fan club.
All right. Well, we'll
right.
be each other's pals. Bishop Michael Curry, thank you so much to all of you who joined us. I hope that you take away something that will change your behavior in 10 minutes or 10 days. So good night to everybody. Good night, Bishop Curry.
Good night, everybody. God bless.